The air does not break, it only heavy thickens. If you had been standing on a narrow, packed dirt road in southern France in the early winter of 1347, you would not have heard the drums of an invading army. You would not have seen banners cresting the hill. You would have heard only the wind in the bare oak trees, the distant barking of a farm dog, and the slow, rhythmic scrape of an iron-rimmed cartwheel on the stones. We tend to think of history as something loud. We imagine the past as a cacophony of battles, of crumbling empires and shouting kings. But the event that fundamentally rewired the human timeline, the catastrophe that emptied half the chairs at the tables of Europe, Asia, and North Africa, did not arrive with a roar. It arrived in complete, heavy silence. It arrived on the breath. There is a surviving object in the climate-controlled archives of a medical museum in London. It is a simple, clouded glass vial, a fragile, hand-blown vessel from a lost century, resting on a bed of archival foam. It once held a mixture of herbs and vinegar, carried in the dark to ward off the invisible. When you look at it under the dim gallery lights, you realize how small it is, how terribly thin the glass is. And the worst part is the sentence that comes next in the archival record, believed to offer absolute protection. The pestilence does not knock, it simply waits in the breath. It waited for a shoemaker in Siena named Agnolo di Tura, an ordinary man, a father, a keeper of ledgers, who was known to his friends as the Fat. In a few short months, the sudden silence of the plague would force him to pick up a shovel, walk out into the dry Tuscan dirt, and write a single devastating sentence about his own 5 children, a sentence we still cannot shake from the historical record. Welcome to History for Sleepyheads. Wherever you are right now, whatever time it is there in your part of the world, settle in. Let your shoulders drop. Let the room fade. If you enjoy this slow journey into the past, I'd be grateful if you left a gentle like on the video. It helps this quiet corner of history find others who need a place to rest. Tonight, we are stepping into the deep shadows of the 14th through 17th centuries. Over the next several hours, across 10 chapters, we will travel from the cobblestones of Paris to the devastated, beautiful hills of Siena. We will walk the harbor docks of a quarantined port, step inside the desperate medical beliefs of the era, and journey to a small English village that made an unimaginable sacrifice. We will look at the dark reality of the plague, not with panic, but with a calm, steady gaze. We will find the quiet humanity that persisted even when the world seemed to be ending. In this quiet century, you belong to the passing bell. You can close your eyes. You don't need to stay awake for the end. The history will still be here, keeping watch long after you drift away. The shadow cast against the sun-baked Roman plaster is tall, and it moves with a deliberate, terrifying slowness. In the high summer of 1656, as a devastating wave of the plague swept through the Italian peninsula, the streets of Rome were completely empty. The wooden shutters of the palazzos were pulled tight. The heavy, iron-studded doors were bolted from the inside. The city was holding its breath. The bustling, chaotic energy of the 17th century metropolis had been replaced by a profound, hollow silence. And then a sound broke the quiet. Top, top, top. A wooden cane striking the cobblestones.
The sound echoed off the high walls, rhythmic and unhurried. The figure that stepped around the corner seemed pulled entirely from a nightmare. He wore a wide-brimmed black leather hat, casting a dark shadow over his features. A long, heavy coat of Moroccan leather draped all the way to his ankles, coated in a thick, shining layer of animal suet. His hands were hidden inside heavy leather gauntlets. But it was the face that stopped the heart. The face was not human. It was a long, curving bird's beak, half a foot in length, pointing downward toward the chest. Where the eyes should be, two flat, clouded glass discs reflected the pale Roman sunlight. He did not speak. He pointed with the white wooden cane. He was the medico della peste, the plague doctor. This image, the man in the beak mask, has become the universal, haunting symbol of the Black Death. We see it in textbooks, in woodcuts, in modern retellings of the medieval apocalypse. It is the visual shorthand for the terror of the plague. But there is a strange, quiet truth about the man in the beak mask, a paradox that makes the figure even more fascinating when viewed through the lens of actual history. If you had looked out through the wooden shutters of a window in London or Florence or Avignon during the original catastrophic wave of the Black Death in 1348, you would never have seen him. He did not exist. The plague doctor in this iconic, terrifying uniform is not a medieval creation at all. He was the invention of a single man living centuries later. His name was Charles Delorme. He was the chief physician to three French kings, Henri IV, Louis XIII, and Louis XIV. Delorme was a man of the 17th century, an era of early enlightenment, of scientific academies, of meticulous record-keeping. In the year 1619, as the plague flared again across the European continent, Delorme sat at his wooden desk in Paris and designed a suit of armor. Not armor against swords or musket balls or arrows, armor against the air itself.
To understand why Charles Delorme designed the beak, we have to understand how he and every educated physician of his time believed the physical world worked. They did not know about bacteria. They did not know about the Yersinia pestis bacillus, quietly multiplying in the bellies of fleas, riding on the backs of black rats in the cargo holds of merchant ships. They did not know about microbiology or the transmission of pathogens through the bloodstream. They believed in miasma. Miasma was the heavy, corrupted air. It was a physical, tangible decay that floated off stagnant swamps, unwashed bodies, and shallow graves. The pestilence does not knock. It simply waits in the breath. Medical theory of the time dictated that if a person breathed in this corrupted, foul-smelling vapor, it would enter the lungs, travel directly to the heart, and poison the four humors of the human body: the blood, the yellow bile, the black bile, and the phlegm. Once the humors were corrupted, the body would boil over in fever, producing the dark, agonizing swellings known as buboes. The plague, to the 17th century mind, was quite literally an odor that could kill you. And so Charles Delorme engineered the beak mask as a deeply rational scientific filtration system. He wrote down the exact specifications for this defensive garment, leaving a historical record that survives to this day. The nose, Delorme wrote in 1619, is half a foot long, shaped like a beak, filled with perfume, with only 2 holes, one on each side near the nostrils. But that can suffice to breathe and to carry along with the air one breathes the impression of the drugs enclosed further along in the beak.
Look closely at the beak in the surviving sketches and museum pieces. It is not an attempt to look like a raven or a crow or a bird of prey, as later folklore and carnival traditions would suggest. It was a respirator. The beak was specifically designed to be exactly 6 inches long because the physicians believed the corrupted air needed time and distance to be purified before it reached the vulnerable nostrils of the doctor. The entire cavity of the leather cone was not empty. It was packed densely and meticulously with a potent mixture of aromatic herbs, spices, and dried flowers. This medical compound was known as theriac. The recipe was incredibly complex, often containing upwards of 60 different botanical and chemical ingredients. The historical accounts of theriac preparation read like the inventory of an apothecary's vault. There was the sharp, overwhelming sting of camphor and dried mint, the deep resinous scent of myrrh and frankincense, crushed cloves, rose petals, and storax. A sponge soaked in sharp, acidic vinegar was often wedged near the breathing holes. Some wealthy doctors even added a small amount of ambergris, a highly prized waxy substance produced in the digestive system of sperm whales, known for its intense, earthy fragrance that could overpower the stench of decay.
When the plague doctor took a breath, the ambient air was drawn through the tiny holes at the tip of the beak, pulled forcefully through this dense thicket of heavy, overpowering perfumes, and delivered safely to the nose. The smell of death in the streets, the sweet, terrible odor of the sick rooms was completely blocked out. The doctor was breathing a localized, artificial atmosphere of flowers and spices trapped inside a dark leather cone. The rest of the uniform, as Delorme described it, was built on the exact same logic of total environmental isolation. Under the coat, Delorme instructed, we wear boots made in Moroccan leather, from the front of the breeches in smooth skin. The coat itself was a massive garment that fell to the ankles, but leather alone was not enough to stop the miasma. The fabric was deeply impregnated with suet, hard animal fat, and wax. Delorme specified that the coat must be tucked tightly into the breeches tied firmly to the boots, and the shirt seamlessly tucked into the gloves. The greased, slippery exterior of the coat was designed so that the deadly miasma, which they pictured as a sticky, clinging vapor, almost like an invisible syrup, would simply slide off the doctor like water rolling off a waxed canvas tent. Nothing could stick to him, nothing could penetrate the seams. The glass eyes, too, were an essential part of the prescription. They were not designed for anonymity or intimidation. Medical theory of the time suggested that the disease could possibly enter the body through the pores or even be transmitted through the visual gaze of a dying patient. The eyes of the physician had to be shielded behind thick, protective crystal. And finally, there was the cane, the simple white wooden wand that tapped along the cobblestones. The cane was the doctor's only connection to the physical world outside his waxed leather shell. Contemporary accounts note that the staff was used to enforce distance. The doctor used it to direct families to move their afflicted loved ones without getting too close. He used it to point out which doors needed to be marked with a painted cross, signaling a quarantined household. Most importantly, he used the cane to lift the bed sheets of a patient or to remove their clothing, to examine the dark, swollen buboes on the neck or groin, all without ever letting his gloved hands make physical contact with the infected skin. And tragically, he often used it to fend off desperate, panicked people in the streets who would rush toward him, begging for a cure, begging for salvation. The experience of being the man in the beak mask must have been profoundly, intensely lonely. Put yourself, for just a moment, inside that heavy leather suit. It is high summer in a Mediterranean city. The sun is unrelenting. The thick leather coat, heavy with animal grease, traps all of your body heat. You are sweating profusely. The air inside the beak is suffocatingly thick with the smell of camphor and vinegar, burning your nostrils, making your eyes water behind the glass lenses. Every breath takes effort. Your peripheral vision is entirely gone. You can only see straight ahead through the foggy, distorted discs. Your hearing is muffled by the heavy leather hood wrapping tightly around your ears. You walk through a silent city. You are completely isolated inside your own armor. The slow, rhythmic scrape of an iron-rimmed cartwheel on the stones sounds somewhere in the next street over. You are a ghost, a moving among ghosts. You are respected, but you are deeply, universally feared. When people look out from their shuttered windows and see you passing, they cross themselves. They know that where the beak mask goes, the end of the world is following closely behind. These men were often not the elite, wealthy physicians of the era. The most successful doctors, the men who attended the royal courts and the rich merchants, had already fled the cities at the first whisper of plague, retreating to their country estates where the air was clear. The men who stayed behind to put on the leather coats were usually second-rate doctors, young physicians trying to make a name for themselves, or even laymen with no medical training at all, hired by desperate city councils out of sheer necessity. These municipal plague doctors, or medici condoti, were bound by strict legal contracts. They were paid exceptionally well by the state, but the mortality rate among them was staggering. The suit, despite Charles Delorme's ingenious design and meticulous logic, could not stop a flea bite. The waxed leather could not completely keep out the infected rats that scurried across the floors of the sick rooms. In this quiet century, you belong to the passing bell. The doctors in the beak masks walked their rounds, tapping their canes on the stones, breathing their mint and myrrh, writing their meticulous notes on the progression of the fever, and then, very often, they too fell quiet. They died in the very armor they believed would save them. When we look back at the plague doctor today, sitting in the comfort of a world that understands germ theory, it is easy to see a monster. It is easy to see a piece of Gothic theater, a spooky silhouette meant to frighten children, a character from a Venetian carnival or a dark fantasy. The mask looks like ignorance. It looks like madness. But Charles Delorme was not a madman, and the men who wore his suit were not monsters. They were men of profound logic, working with the tools and truths of their time. They saw an invisible enemy destroying their world, and they built a fortress of leather, glass, and herbs to stand against it. Every stitch, every inch of the beak, every crushed clove was an act of desperate, courageous hope. It was science, reaching blindly into the dark, trying to hold back the tide of human suffering. From today's view, it is a grotesque Halloween costume. From their view, it was the pinnacle of modern science, a desperate shield against poisoned air. And that's what's so chilling.
The ink is black. The parchment is heavy. The handwriting is careful, meticulous, and completely broken by grief. Before the plague doctors wore their leather masks in the 17th century, there was the original terror, the Great Mortality of 1348. To truly understand what it felt like when the world suddenly stopped making sense, we must look away from the doctors and look toward the people who simply sat at their desks, lit a candle, and tried to write down what was happening outside their windows. The pestilence does not knock, it simply waits in the breath. In the rolling, cypress-lined hills of Tuscany sits the city of Siena. Today, it is a masterpiece of medieval architecture, a sun-baked jewel of brick and stone. But in the spring of 1348, it was a city at the height of its wealth and power, completely unaware that it was about to fall into a sudden, suffocating dark. Living in Siena at that time was a man named Agnolo di Tura. He was not a king, he was not a general, he was a shoemaker, a man who worked with his hands, smelling of tanned leather and beeswax. He was also a local tax collector, a man accustomed to keeping orderly ledgers, accustomed to a world where deaths were recorded, sums were tallied, and logic prevailed. He was a husband, and he was a father to 5 children. He was, by all accounts, an ordinary man, living an ordinary, busy life. And then the spring winds shifted. The sickness arrived in Siena in May. We know exactly what happened because Agnolo di Tura left us his diary. He did not write with the flowery, exaggerated prose of a poet. He wrote with the blunt, devastating precision of a man who has run out of tears, a man just trying to make the ledger balance when all the numbers have gone wrong. The mortality in Siena began in May, Agnolo wrote, his quill scratching loudly in the quiet room. It was a cruel and horrible thing. It seemed that almost everyone became stupefied seeing the pain. It is impossible for the human tongue to recount the awful truth. Indeed, one who did not see such horribleness can be called blessed. Agnolo tells us how the victims died almost immediately. A fever would take hold, the swelling would appear under the armpits and in the groin, and then speech would fail. The victims fell while walking in the streets. They fell while working in their shops. But it is the logistics of the tragedy that Agnolo records with such quiet, heartbreaking clarity. As the death toll rose, the customs of a civilized society simply collapsed under the sheer weight of the numbers. The rhythmic scrape of the iron-rimmed dead cart on the cobblestones became the only sound left in the city. There was no one who wept for any death, for all awaited death.
Imagine that level of exhaustion. The emotional reserves of the entire city were so entirely depleted that there was no energy left for mourning. The passing bell rang so often that the priests finally stopped ringing it, for fear of driving the remaining survivors mad with the constant, tolling reminder. And they died by the hundreds, both day and night, Agnolo di Tura continued. And as soon as those ditches were filled, more were dug. And I, Agnolo di Tura, called the Fat, buried my 5 children with my own hands. Read that sentence again in the quiet of your room. And I, Agnolo di Tura, called the Fat, buried my 5 children with my own hands. He includes his nickname, called the Fat, a touch of deep, poignant humanity, a reminder that he was a familiar face in the taverns, a man people knew, a man with a sense of humor and a robust life. Now he was standing in the dry dirt of a trench, lowering his entire family into the earth, alone. He was not alone in his actions, even if he felt alone in his grief. Agnolo notes that many others in Siena were forced to do the exact same thing, and he notes a detail that only an eyewitness could provide, a detail that brings the absolute dread of 1348 into sharp focus. And there were also those who were so sparsely covered with earth that the dogs dragged them forth and devoured many bodies throughout the city. 50 miles to the north, in the magnificent city of Florence, another man was dipping his quill into ink. His name was Giovanni Boccaccio. Unlike the shoemaker Agnolo,
Boccaccio was a literary man, a poet and a scholar. He would survive the plague and go on to write the Decameron, a masterpiece of Italian literature. The premise of his famous book is telling. 10 young, wealthy Florentines flee the plague-ridden city and retreat to a secluded villa in the countryside, where they spend 2 weeks telling each other stories to pass the time and forget the horrors outside. But in the introduction to the Decameron, Boccaccio drops the fiction. He drops the storytelling. He looks directly at the reality of what happened to Florence in that terrible year, and he provides one of the most vivid, terrifying primary sources in human history. Boccaccio watched the social fabric of his beloved city completely unravel. He noted how the disease severed the deepest human bonds. In this quiet century, you belong to the passing bell. The fear of infection was so absolute, so overpowering, that it overrode basic human instinct. Brother was forsaken by brother, nephew by uncle, brother by sister, and, oftentimes, husband by wife. Nay, what is more, and scarcely to be believed, fathers and mothers were found to abandon their own children, untended, unvisited, to their fate, as if they had been strangers.
It is easy to judge them from the safety of the modern world, to think that we would be braver, that we would hold the hands of the sick. But Boccaccio makes it clear that the contagion was so aggressive, so seemingly magical in its ability to jump from person to person, that people believed even looking at a sick person's clothes could kill you. He recounts a specific haunting memory he saw with his own eyes in the streets of Florence. The rags of a poor man who had died of the plague were tossed out into the street. 2 pigs came wandering down the alley. Boccaccio watched from a window as the pigs approached the rags. Rooting around, they took the cloth in their teeth, shaking it about, searching for food. Almost immediately, Boccaccio wrote, they gave a few turns and fell down, dead, as if by poison, on the rags which they had just touched. When you see an animal drop dead just from touching a piece of wool, you do not stay to comfort the sick. You run, you bolt the door, you hide. The wealthy of Florence locked themselves in their palazzos, eating delicate foods and drinking fine wines in moderation, refusing to speak to anyone from the outside, filling their rooms with music. Others took the opposite approach. Believing they were going to die anyway, they formed groups that roamed from tavern to tavern, drinking heavily day and night, breaking into abandoned mansions and using them as their own, living in a state of continuous frantic revelry. And then there was the middle class, the people who could not afford to flee and who did not want to riot. They stayed in their homes, clutching posies of flowers, holding herbs to their noses to ward off the heavy, corrupted air. They died in their beds, their passing only noticed by their neighbors when the terrible smell of decomposition leaked out under the door frames. In Florence, there were no longer any tears or candles or solemn mourners walking behind the casket. The dead were simply placed outside the front door on the cobblestones. In the early morning light, Boccaccio noted, the streets were lined with corpses, waiting for the carts.
Things had come to such a pass, he wrote, that no more care was had for a dying human being than a goat. When we read these letters and these chronicles today, sitting in comfortable chairs with the lights on, the numbers are hard to process. Florence lost perhaps 60% of its population in a matter of months. Siena lost more than half. The vast, bustling energy of the early Renaissance was suddenly replaced by a profound, hollow silence. But the truth of the Black Death does not live in the grand statistics. It does not live in the percentage of the population lost or the economic impact of a shrinking labor force. The truth of the plague lives in the quiet, desperate scratch of Agnolo di Tura's pen. It lives in the image of a shoemaker, a man with a joke and a nickname, standing in the dirt of a mass grave, his hands blistered from the shovel, covering his 5 children with a thin layer of Tuscan soil, while the dogs prowled in the shadows just beyond the cemetery wall. From today's view, it is a historical data point, a paragraph in a textbook about the demographic collapse of medieval Europe. From their view, it was the literal end of the world, experienced one devastating, lonely shovelful of dirt at a time. And that's what's so chilling.
The water is black, and it smells of old salt, wet hemp, and deep, unquestioning time. If you were to stand on the stone quays of a medieval Mediterranean harbor at dawn, the sea would seem like a vast, breathing lung. The tide pulls out, the tide pulls in. The sea was the great connector of the 14th century world, the highway of silk, spice, and silver. But in the autumn of 1347, the sea brought something else. It brought a silence that would consume a continent. In the northern Italian city of Piacenza, a notary named Gabriele de Mussi sat at his heavy wooden desk. He was a man of the law, a man whose life was measured in contracts, land deeds, and careful, undeniable facts. But as he dipped his quill to write his famous chronicle, Historia de Morbo, he was trying to document the unimaginable. He was tracing the exact path of how the apocalypse had physically crossed the water. The story de Mussi recorded begins with a haunting, counterintuitive truth. When the infected ships finally reached the coast of Sicily, the men of the port did the only sensible thing. They turned the ships away. They drew their swords, they drove the dying sailors back onto their decks, and they forced the galleys back out into the open water. And it made no difference at all, because the thing they were afraid of had already done the one thing that mattered. To understand how the sickness boarded those ships, de Mussi's chronicle takes us back 1 year, to 1346, on the shores of the Black Sea. Here sat the walled port city of Kaffa, known today as Feodosia in modern Crimea. Kaffa was a bustling, prosperous Genoese trading post, a fortress of stone and commerce perched on the edge of the known world. But outside its walls, an army was waiting. The Mongol army of the Golden Horde had laid siege to Kaffa. The Genoese merchants were trapped inside, watching from the ramparts as the vast encampment of nomadic warriors blockaded their gates. But the Mongols were not attacking. They were dying. A mysterious, devastating fever had swept through the Mongol camp. De Mussi recorded the horror of it from the perspective of those watching from the walls. The dying Tartars, he wrote, stunned and stupefied by the immensity of the disaster brought about by the disease, and realizing that they had no hope of escape, lost interest in the siege. But before the Mongols broke their camp and retreated, their commander made a decision that would alter the course of human history. It was an act of biological warfare, executed with brutal medieval machinery. They loaded the rotting, infected corpses of their own dead soldiers onto the slings of their great wooden trebuchets.
Imagine the mechanical sequence in the heavy, quiet air of the Black Sea coast. The groan of the massive wooden beams being winched backwards, the tightening of the thick hemp ropes, the heavy, terrible silence of the payload being loaded, and then the snap of the release.
Demussy describes how the bodies flew through the air, tumbling over the high stone walls of Kaffa, landing in the streets and on the rooftops with a sickening, heavy thud. Mountains of dead were thrown into the city, the notary wrote, nor could the Christians hide there or flee from them, although they dumped as many of the bodies as they could into the sea. And soon the rotting corpses tainted the air and poisoned the water supply, and no one knew or could discover a means of defense. The Genoese merchants were terrified. The stench of the decomposing bodies filled the narrow streets of the fortress. The air felt heavy, tainted, and deeply wrong. Believing that this foul, corrupted air, the miasma, was poisoning them, the surviving merchants made a desperate run for it. They loaded their cargo, boarded their long, sleek wooden galleys, and broke through the blockade, sailing west toward the Mediterranean. They thought they were escaping the death of Kaffa. They did not know they had already packed it into the holds. From today's view, with the cool, clinical distance of modern science, we understand exactly what was hidden in those ships. We know about the black rats, Rattus rattus, making their nests in the grain sacks and the damp coils of rope. We know about the oriental rat fleas, Synopsilla chaopus, carrying the Yersinia pestis bacteria in their blocked foreguts, starving, biting, and regurgitating the pathogen into the bloodstream of their hosts. We know the microscopic mechanics of the vector. But the Genoese sailors knew nothing of microbiology. Do not impose our modern knowledge onto their medieval terror. To them, the danger was the air itself. As the 12 galleys sailed westward, the sailors began to fall ill. The fever spiked. The agonizing, egg-sized swellings, the buboes, erupted in the armpits and the groin. The men bled beneath the skin, the blood pooling into dark, purplish-black spots. In the confined, claustrophobic space of a wooden galley, surrounded by the vast, indifferent ocean, the terror must have been absolute. There was nowhere to run. They burned strong-smelling herbs on the decks to cleanse the air, but the sickness kept moving from man to man. The cold, the quiet, the waiting. By October of 1347, the fleet had crossed the Mediterranean. 12 Genoese galleys, their sails slack, their crews decimated, limped toward the horizon off the coast of Sicily. They steered for the bustling, wealthy port of Messina. A working harbor should be loud. It should be a chaotic symphony of shouting stevedores, the clatter of wooden crates on stone, the sharp cries of gulls, and the ringing of merchant bells. But as these 12 galleys drifted toward the quay in Messina, there was a strange, heavy quiet. The Franciscan friar, Michael of Piazza, was in Messina when the ships arrived, and he left us a meticulous, horrifying account of that October week. He noted that the smell reached the docks before the mooring lines did, a smell of tar, brine, and the sweet, terrible odor of human decay. The ships docked. The remaining sailors, pale, sweating, and weak, tied off the heavy ropes. The sailors brought in their bones a disease so violent, Friar Michael wrote, that whoever spoke to them was infected and could in no way save himself from death. He noted how the sickness seemed to cling to the very breath of the Genoese. The people of Messina, eager for news from the east and eager for trade, walked down to the waterfront. They stood on the stone quays. They spoke to the sailors across the wooden rails. They exchanged coins. They breathed the same coastal air. The pestilence does not knock. It simply waits in the breath. It took only a few days for the city to realize what it had welcomed into its harbor. The people of Messina began to develop the exact same dark swellings as the sailors. The fever ripped through the port with a speed that defied logic. Friar Michael documented the gruesome progression, the intense boiling heat in the blood, the coughing up of blood, and the sudden violent death that usually followed within 3 days. Panic, absolute and primal, overtook the city. The authorities of Messina finally realized the source of the nightmare. They gathered armed guards, marched down to the docks, and violently expelled the Genoese ships. They ordered the dying sailors to cast off their lines and take their cursed vessels back out into the open sea. The galleys drifted away from Sicily, rejected, seeking any port that would take them, eventually spreading the infection to Genoa, Venice, and Marseille. But the expulsion of the ships from Messina was a meaningless gesture. The invisible weight had already settled over the Sicilian streets. The disease had stepped off the boats. It had walked into the taverns, the marketplaces, and the churches. In the weeks that followed, the rhythmic scrape of the iron-rimmed cartwheel on the cobblestones became the only reliable sound in Messina. Scrape, clatter, scrape. The dead carts moving through the morning fog. The grave diggers working until their hands bled, piling the bodies into deep trenches outside the city walls. This season, you belong to the passing bell. The priests rang the bells for the dead until there were no priests left to pull the ropes. The arrival of the plague in Messina by sea left a deep, permanent scar on the European psyche. The terror of the approaching sail, the fear of the unknown cargo, fundamentally changed how cities interacted with the water. It is exactly this trauma that 30 years later would cause the port city of Ragusa, modern-day Dubrovnik, and later the great maritime republic of Venice to invent a desperate new law. They ordered that any ship arriving from a plague-suspected region must drop anchor in an isolated lagoon. The ship, its cargo, and its crew were forbidden from making contact with the shore for exactly 40 days. In the Venetian dialect, 40 days is 40 giorni. From that desperate waiting period in the lagoon, we get the modern word quarantine. It is a word born entirely from the memory of the 12 galleys of Messina, a word designed to keep the ghost ships at bay.
The tragedy of the Black Death's arrival is how mundane the mechanics of it were. There was no grand invasion. There was no clash of empires on the beaches of Sicily. There were just tired sailors, sick and far from home, tossing a heavy hemp rope to a dock worker on a quiet October morning. A few words exchanged, a breath inhaled. From today's view, it is a documented epidemiological event, an entry point on a map that tracks the transmission vector from the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. From their view, it was the sea itself turning against them, delivering an invisible, silent doom in the hulls of their own merchant ships. And that's what's so chilling.
The parchment is heavy, the ink is dark, and the silence in the room is absolute. In the late autumn of 1348, as the frost began to harden the mud in the streets of Paris, the most learned men in Europe gathered in a candlelit hall. These were the master physicians of the medical faculty at the University of Paris. They had been summoned by King Philip VI of France and given a single, impossible task: explain why the world was ending. They sat at their heavy oak tables, surrounded by brass astrolabes, illuminated manuscripts, and the collected wisdom of antiquity. They consulted the texts of the Greeks, the Romans, and the great Islamic scholars of the Golden Age, and after weeks of careful, methodical deliberation, they dipped their quills and signed their names to the stars. The master physicians produced a detailed, authoritative report. The cause of the Great Mortality, they declared with absolute scientific certainty, was a celestial event that had occurred 3 years prior. On the 20th of March, 1345, at exactly 1 o'clock in the afternoon, a rare and terrible triple conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars had taken place in the house of Aquarius. Jupiter, being warm and wet, had drawn up evil vapors from the earth and the seas. Mars, being hot and dry, had ignited them. This cosmic collision had corrupted the atmosphere of the earth, creating a poisonous fog that was now drifting across the continents. When we read the Paris medical report today, it is easy to dismiss it as medieval superstition. It is easy to look back at them with the condescension of the modern age. But the worst part isn't that they were wrong, it's how reasonable it sounded. They were not stupid. They had universities, libraries, and the accumulated medicine of 1,000 years, and every single tool that brilliance gave them made it worse. To understand the deep intellectual dread of the 14th century, you have to step inside their worldview. You must unlearn everything you know about biology. Forget about bacteria. Forget about the microscopic world. Forget about the blocked foregut of the oriental rat flea and the black rats scurrying in the holds of merchant galleys. That is the modern explanation, invisible to the medieval eye. To the people of 1348, the human body was not a machine of cells and organs. It was a fragile, precariously balanced vessel of 4 liquids. This was the theory of the 4 humors, handed down from the ancient physicians Hippocrates and Galen. The universe was made of 4 elements: earth, air, fire, and water. And the human body mirrored the universe, containing 4 humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Health was simply a state of perfect balance between these 4 liquids. Illness was an imbalance. If a person was sick, they were literally overflowing with an excess of one of the humors. The logic of the era dictated that the only way to cure the patient was to drain the excess. Imagine the sensory reality of a physician's visit in the 14th century. The heavy velvet curtains are drawn tight against the light. The room smells of stale sweat and dried lavender. The physician approaches the bed. He does not listen to the heart or take a temperature. He looks at the color of the urine in a glass flask. He feels the heat radiating from the skin. And then, acting on 1,000 years of established medical consensus, he opens a vein.
The physician used a sharp iron lancet to pierce the skin of the arm. The dark, heavy blood flows into a shallow brass basin. Drip, drip, drip. They believed that by bleeding the patient, or by administering violent purgatives to empty the stomach and the bowels, they were helping the body restore its natural harmony. The tragedy, of course, is that the plague was a disease that caused catastrophic internal hemorrhaging and profound, rapid dehydration. By bleeding and purging the victims, the greatest medical minds in Europe were actively accelerating their deaths. They were draining the last reserves of strength from bodies that were already fighting a losing war. But how had the humors become so violently unbalanced in the first place? What was the trigger? The answer, according to the Paris faculty and every educated mind of the time, was miasma. Miasma was the corrupted air.
It was a physical, tangible pollution that carried the taint of the stars and the stench of the earth. The night air was a heavy, prowling thing. The silence leans against the door, but the miasma seeps beneath it. The medieval mind reasoned that if bad smells caused the disease, then good smells could fight it. This is why the people of the 14th century carried small perforated metal spheres called palmanders, filled with ambergris, crushed cloves, and sweet myrrh. It is why they burned massive bonfires of juniper, pine, and rosemary in the public squares, filling the cities with a thick, resinous wood smoke. It is why they nailed their wooden shutters tightly closed at night, terrified of the damp, cooling breeze. The pestilence does not knock, it simply waits in the breath. In the southern French city of Avignon, the seat of the papacy during this era, the miasma theory led to one of the most remarkable accidental survivals of the plague years. Looming over Avignon was the Palais des Papes, a massive Gothic fortress of stone where Pope Clement VI resided. As the death toll in the city climbed into the tens of thousands, the Pope's personal physician, a brilliant and observant man named Guy de Chauliac, took charge of the pontiff's survival. Guy de Chauliac was a rarity in his time. He did not flee. He stayed in Avignon, visiting the sick, examining the agonizing swellings and documenting the horrors in his great medical text, the Chirurgia Magna. He even contracted the disease himself, suffering the boiling fever and the buboes for 6 terrible weeks before miraculously recovering. To protect Pope Clement VI from the corrupted air, Chauliac prescribed an extreme regimen based entirely on the miasma theory. He ordered the Pope to retreat to a small enclosed chamber deep within the palace. In this room, Chauliac ordered 2 massive, roaring fires to be built at each end of the chamber. The Pope was instructed to sit exactly between these 2 fires, day and night, throughout the entire sweltering summer of 1348. He was not to leave, he was not to admit visitors. Imagine the oppressive, suffocating reality of that room. The southern French summer is already brutally hot. Now add the blazing, radiant heat of 2 continuous bonfires burning heavy oak logs, the smoke stinging the eyes, the sweat pouring down the face of the most powerful man in the Christian world, trapped in a roasting, wood smoke-filled cell. Chauliac believed the intense heat and smoke would purify the air and destroy the miasma. He was completely wrong about the mechanism, but entirely right about the result. Fleas, the actual vector of the disease, are highly sensitive to temperature and despise extreme heat and wood smoke. The roaring fires in the Pope's chamber created an environment where the Xenocilla chaopus flea could not survive. Pope Clement VI lived through the Black Death, saved by a brilliant physician reasoning perfectly from a completely false premise. But for the vast majority of the population, the fires of juniper and the palmanders of myrrh were not enough. The sickness kept coming. And when the accumulated medicine of 1,000 years fails, the human mind turns instinctively toward the heavens. If the air was corrupted, who had corrupted it? The Church provided the only answer that made sense of the chaos. It was the wrath of God. The plague was widely interpreted as an arrow shot from the bow of an angry God, a divine punishment for the sins, the greed, and the wickedness of mankind. And if the disease was a spiritual punishment, then the only logical cure was spiritual penance. Across Europe, the daily rhythms of life were replaced by the rituals of atonement. The sound of the marketplace was replaced by the slow, rhythmic toll of the church bells. The passing bell became the metronome of the medieval world, marking the departure of soul after soul. In this quiet century, you belong to the passing bell.
The most desperate expression of this spiritual terror was the flagellant movement. Thousands of men, known as the Brothers of the Cross, abandoned their homes and marched from city to city. They walked barefoot, wearing simple white robes marked with a red cross. They would gather in the public squares, form large circles, and strip to the waist. Then, to the sound of solemn chants and the tolling bells, they would begin to beat themselves with heavy leather whips tipped with iron studs.
The sensory experience of a flagellant procession was a nightmare of blood and sound. The rhythmic crack of the leather on bare skin, the low, mournful chanting, the smell of sweat, dirt, and open wounds. They believed that by taking the punishment of Christ upon their own bodies, they could appease the wrath of God and spare their cities from the plague. But here lies the final, tragic irony of the medieval worldview. The Church, in its desperate attempt to save souls, ordered mass processions. The priests led barefoot crowds through the streets, carrying holy relics, chanting litanies, begging for mercy. The townsfolk packed themselves tightly into the soaring stone naves of the cathedrals, breathing the same heavy air, pressing shoulder to shoulder. They did not know that the plague could spread from person to person through the microscopic droplets of a cough in the pneumonic form of the disease. They did not know that the fleas in the heavy wool of their cloaks were happily transferring from host to host in the crowded pews. By gathering together in massive numbers to pray for deliverance, they were ensuring their own destruction. Every procession, every crowded mass, every flagellant ritual was a super-spreader event, perfectly designed to accelerate the catastrophe. They fought the invisible with everything they had. They drained the blood, they burned the herbs, they whipped their own backs, and they prayed until their voices cracked. They applied the greatest science and the deepest faith of their era with total, heartbreaking sincerity. From today's view, it is a tragic catalog of astrology, misapplied humors, and desperate superstition. From their view, it was the best science in the world, deployed as a final shield against an angry universe. And that's what's so chilling. The room is heavily shadowed. The heavy wooden shutters pulled tight against the afternoon sun. The air is warm, thick, and perfectly still. In the spring of 1348, sitting in the stricken city of Florence, the poet Giovanni Boccaccio watched this profound stillness settle over the homes of his neighbors. When he sat down to record the reality of the Great Mortality in the introduction to the Decameron, he did not write about the grand theological reasons for the plague. He did not write about the conjunction of the planets or the wrath of the heavens. He wrote with devastating clinical precision about the body. He noted that the sickness did not begin in Italy the way he had heard it began in the East, with a sudden fatal bleeding from the nose. In Florence, it began with a terrible, quiet betrayal of the flesh. In men and women alike, it showed itself first in the folds of the body, in the groin, or under the armpits. Boccaccio described how certain tumors grew in those tender places, some as big as a common apple, others as an egg. The common people of the city, lacking a medical vocabulary, simply called them gavocelli. And soon after these swellings emerged, the dark, bruised blotches began to spread across the arms and the thighs, what Boccaccio called the sure sign of impending death. It was a progression that moved with a terrifying, mechanical certainty.
The swelling appeared on a Monday. By the time the priest was sent for, it was already too late. And the reason it was too late is the part no one could have known. The pestilence does not knock, it simply waits in the breath. Long before the first flush of fever warmed the cheek, long before the skin grew hot to the touch, the affliction was already inside. It had been multiplying in the dark, silent chambers of the bloodstream for days. By the time the first gavocello appeared on the skin, the invisible war within the body had already been lost. Let us walk through those 3 days, gently, clinically, without panic. Imagine the quiet reality of the medieval sick room. On the first day, the symptom is merely a deep, unshakable fatigue. The victim feels a sudden chill, a shivering that no heavy wool blanket can seem to warm. There is an ache in the joints, a heaviness in the limbs, as if the bones themselves have turned to lead. And then a localized tenderness begins. The human body possesses a vast, invisible network of vessels and nodes, the lymphatic system, designed to filter out poisons and protect the blood. When the Yersinia pestis bacteria enters the body, it is immediately swept into this network. The bacteria travel to the nearest lymph node, usually in the groin, the armpit, or the neck, and there they begin to relentlessly multiply. The node becomes engorged. It swells against the surrounding tissue. This swollen, inflamed lymph node is the bubo. It is from this specific, localized swelling that the bubonic plague takes its name.
To the touch of a caregiver on that second day, the bubo feels hard, hot, and incredibly tense beneath the skin. The pain is described in the chronicles as a deep, burning ache. As the body realizes it is under catastrophic attack, it mounts a desperate, violent defense. The fever spikes. The heat radiating from the patient is immense. If you were to place your cool hand against their forehead, the skin would feel thin, dry, and burning like parchment left too close to a fire. A terrible, unquenchable thirst sets in. The sick room begins to take on a very specific, heavy scent, a smell all the chroniclers struggle to describe, a sweet, cloying odor of sweat, stale water, and deep internal decay. A damp cloth, a spoken prayer, a shuttered window. The caregiver moves quietly, speaking in whispers, watching the chest rise and fall. By the 3rd day, the final stage begins. The bacteria overwhelm the lymph nodes and spill directly into the bloodstream. This is when the dark spots that Boccaccio observed begin to appear. The medieval physicians believed these dark, purplish-black blotches were the corrupted humors rising to the surface of the skin. Modern medicine knows it as acral necrosis, the pooling of blood beneath the skin as the internal vessels begin to hemorrhage and fail. The extremities, the fingers, the toes, the tip of the nose, turn dark as the circulation collapses. The body simply begins to power down. The intense pain of the buboes often fades into a heavy, numbing lethargy. The breath grows shallow. The fever dismantles the consciousness, sending the patient into a quiet, wandering delirium, and finally into a deep, unshakable sleep. It is not always a violent end. Very often it is a profound, ultimate exhaustion. The heart slows. The room grows completely still. The most terrifying aspect of this bodily collapse was its sheer, uncompromising speed. It was a timeline that broke the human mind's ability to process grief. The transition from perfect health to the grave was so rapid that it spawned a chilling, universally repeated observation across the Italian peninsula. The chroniclers noted with a dark, shell-shocked poetry that a man could be perfectly well in the morning, eat lunch with his friends, and eat dinner with his ancestors in paradise. But the buboes and the 3-day fever were only one face of the curse. Further north, in the papal city of Avignon, the brilliant physician Guy de Chauliac was meticulously documenting the bodies of his own patients. Chauliac noticed something that deeply troubled him. He realized that the epidemic, which lasted 7 long months in his city, did not act the same way the entire time. It had 2 distinct, terrifying forms. The disease, Chauliac wrote in his masterwork, was of 2 types. The first lasted 2 months with continuous fever and spitting of blood, and from this one died in 3 days. The second lasted for the rest of the time, also with continuous fever, but with apostums and carbuncles on the external parts, principally on the armpits and groin. From this one died in 5 days. Chauliac was observing the difference between the bubonic plague and its even deadlier, faster variant, the pneumonic plague.
While the bubonic form attacked the lymph nodes and was fatal in perhaps 50 to 60% of cases, the pneumonic form attacked the lungs directly. It bypassed the lymphatic system entirely. The victims of this second form did not develop the agonizing swellings. Instead, they experienced a sudden, crushing tightness in the chest. They developed a rapid, liquid cough. They began to bring up blood from the lungs. The pneumonic form was an absolute death sentence. It was nearly 100% fatal, and it moved with a speed that defied comprehension. While the buboes took 3 to 5 days to end a life, the pneumonic form could extinguish a healthy adult in 24 to 48 hours. Keep the medieval worldview intact as you imagine this. They did not know that the bubonic form was transmitted by the bite of a flea, while the pneumonic form was transmitted directly from human to human, carried on the invisible droplets of a bloody cough. They did not understand the vectors of transmission. They only knew that the sickness could change its mask. They saw a disease that could rot a man from the outside in, or drown him from the inside out. The profound, inescapable reality of this illness changed the very acoustics of the medieval city. In a house where the plague had entered, the normal sounds of daily life, the clatter of wooden bowls, the sweeping of the hearth, the voices of children, simply ceased. The sound metronome of the era begins to slow down here. The passing bell, which had rung so constantly that it lost all meaning, is eventually ordered to stop, lest the constant tolling drive the remaining survivors mad with despair. The scrape of the cartwheel on the cobblestones fades away as the streets empty entirely. What is left is a heavy, suffocating silence, the quiet of a house where the struggle has ended, the stillness of a room where a damp cloth rests forgotten on a wooden chair, and the air smells faintly of crushed herbs and exhaustion. In this quiet century, you belong to the passing bell. The body is a fragile, beautiful machine, and in the middle of the 14th century, that machine encountered an enemy it had no instructions for fighting. It simply surrendered thousands of times a day in silent, shuttered rooms across the known world. From today's view, it is Yersinia pestis, a bacterial infection we can look at under a microscope, a flea bite we can name, an illness we can cure in a few days with a simple course of antibiotics. From their view, it was a terrifying 3-day plunge from perfect health into the grave, with no cause, no logic, and absolutely no cure. And that's what's so chilling.
The parchment of the municipal order is stiff, printed in heavy black ink, and it carries the unmistakable pressed seal of the Lord Mayor. When we look back at the administrative records of the great outbreaks, particularly the devastating wave that struck London in the sweltering summer of 1665, we see the frantic paperwork of a city trying to govern the apocalypse. The government realized very quickly that the sheer exponential scale of mortality had outgrown the traditional authorities. The magistrates were fleeing. The wealthy merchants were locking their estates and escaping to the clean air of the country. The city was left to the poor, and the poor were dying in numbers that broke the mechanisms of normal civic life. The logistics of mass death required a new, desperate ecosystem of labor. A shadow society had to be mobilized to manage the ruined city. To create this workforce, the city printed the orders conceived and published by the Lord Mayor and Aldermen of the City of London. Nailed to the heavy wooden doors of the guild halls and the parish churches, these broadsheets outlined the brutal rules of quarantine. But buried in the text was a mandate that created a specific, deeply feared role. There was one job in the plague town that no one wanted and everyone needed, and the people who did it were treated as if they were already half dead themselves. They were called the searchers of the dead. The searchers were not educated physicians. They were not surgeons or apothecaries or magistrates. According to the strict rules of the parishes, they were almost exclusively women, and usually the oldest, poorest, and most destitute widows of the ward. Women who had survived on parish alms and scraps were suddenly elevated to positions of absolute, terrifying authority. The city appointed them out of sheer necessity, paying them a meager wage of 2 pence per body examined. Their job was to walk into the homes of the recently deceased, pull back the heavy linen sheets, examine the cooling flesh of the corpse for the telltale dark swellings of the buboes, and report the official cause of death to the parish clerk. If a searcher woman declared the death was plague, the house was immediately locked from the outside, the healthy family members sealed inside with their dead for 40 days. Her word was absolute ruin. Imagine the sensory reality of being a searcher woman in the parish of St. Giles in the Fields in July of 1665. The law demanded that she live in absolute, uncompromising isolation. She was forbidden to take any other employment. She was forbidden to enter a shop, a tavern, or a market. She was forbidden to mingle with the public. When she walked the cobblestone streets, the white stick tapping softly against the dry stones, the crowds would violently part. People would press themselves flat against the rough plaster walls, covering their mouths with vinegar-soaked cloths, turning their faces away, terrified of the heavy air she disturbed. She was shunned, universally feared, and entirely necessary. She spent her days crossing the thresholds of ruined, silent homes. She smelled the sweet, heavy scent of sickness, the stale water, the burning herbs. She looked at the agonizing truth on the skin of her neighbors, collected her 2 pennies, and walked back out into the glare of the sun. For the searcher woman, the corrupted air was her permanent atmosphere. She walked among the dead all day, a living ghost tethered to the parish registry. Once the searcher made her report and the house was sealed, the next link in the chain of this dark economy was forged: the grave diggers. 300 years earlier, and a continent away, during the terrifying original wave of the Great Mortality in 1348, the poet Giovanni Boccaccio watched the gravediggers of Florence completely transform the geography of his beloved city.
The Italians called them the becchini. They were rough men, drawn from the deepest margins of society. Some were immune survivors. Others were simply desperate men willing to risk the contagion for the exorbitant, inflated wages the city was forced to pay. As the consecrated cemeteries attached to the local parish churches filled up, a process that took only a matter of weeks in a city losing thousands, the becchini were forced to dig massive trenches in the open fields outside the ancient stone walls. Boccaccio left us a meticulous, chilling description of their labor. The sheer volume of the dead meant that the dignity of an individual grave was a mathematical impossibility. He wrote that when the vast trenches were dug deep enough, the dead were brought to the edge in the dark of the night. The becchini lowered them in, not with individual care or solemn prayer, but in vast anonymous layers. They were stacked, Boccaccio wrote, as merchandise is stowed in a ship. It was a terrible mechanical layering, a row of bodies packed tightly shoulder to shoulder in the cold dirt. Then the becchini would throw a thin layer of earth over them, just enough to cover the limbs. Then another layer of bodies, then another layer of earth, repeating the brutal pattern until the trench reached the very surface of the field. The physical reality of the becchini's day is almost impossible to hold in the mind. The blisters forming, breaking, and bleeding on the palms of the hands, the relentless, heavy thud of the iron spade driving into the dry, unyielding Tuscan soil, the smell of the turned earth mixing with the overwhelming, inescapable odor of human decay, the sheer, staggering exhaustion of moving thousands of pounds of dead weight from dawn until the light finally failed, the dirt, the sweat, the silence. But physical disposal was only half the crisis in a medieval city. The people of the 14th century demanded spiritual disposal with equal desperate fervor, and this terrifying duty fell to the priests. The clergy faced an impossible, agonizing choice that tore at the very foundation of their vows. Their sacred duty was to stand by the beds of the dying, to hear their final whispered confessions, and to administer the extreme unction. They were the shepherds who guided the soul safely out of a ruined body.
But to lean close to a dying parishioner, to feel their ragged, fevered breath against your ear as they confessed their sins, to touch their forehead with the holy chrism oil, was an absolute death sentence. The pestilence does not knock, it simply waits in the breath. When a priest knelt by the bed and inhaled the heavy, corrupted air of the sick room, he took the sickness into his own lungs. Because they went exactly where the fire was hottest, the mortality rate among the clergy during the plague was catastrophic. Monasteries were entirely wiped out. Parishes were left completely abandoned as priests either died in droves or, in a profound crisis of faith and fear, simply fled into the countryside to save themselves. As the priests vanished from the cities, the spiritual panic of the common people reached a breaking point. To die without a final confession was, in the rigid medieval worldview, to risk an eternity in purgatory, or worse, damnation. The crisis became so absolute that the institutional church was forced to break its own ancient sacred rules. In January of 1349, Ralph of Shrewsbury, the Bishop of Bath and Wells in England, looked at the utter devastation of his diocese. His priests were dead. His flock was dying in terror. In response, he issued a startling, unprecedented ruling that shocked the medieval order. If they are on the point of death
and cannot secure the services of a priest, the bishop commanded in a pastoral letter, then they should make confession of their sins, according to the teaching of the apostle, to any lay person, even to a woman if a man is not available. To allow a dying man to confess his deepest sins to a woman, a lay person, was a staggering theological concession. It was a true measure of how deeply the institutional structure of the world had fractured. The priests who did remain were walking ghosts, moving mechanically from house to house, their voices hoarse from chanting the exact same heavy Latin prayers, their hands trembling as they held the wooden cross over the dying. And finally, tying all these desperate, isolated lives together was the cart driver. The driver was the mechanism of transport, the vital artery that moved the nightmare from the bedroom to the trench. In the great plagues of the later centuries, the carts often only moved at night. This was a deliberate attempt by the magistrates to hide the true, staggering scale of the mortality from the waking city, hoping to prevent mass riots and panic.
The sound metronome of the plague town was driven entirely by this nocturnal rhythm. Creak, clatter, ring. The heavy, iron-rimmed wooden wheels dragging roughly across the uneven cobblestones. The driver, wrapped in a heavy, grease-coated cloak, holding a pale yellow lantern in one hand and a heavy brass handbell in the other. He would stop his horse at the head of a dark, narrow street, ring the bell loudly into the quiet air, and call out the grim phrase that has echoed down through the centuries of history. "Bring out your dead." The heavy wooden doors would open. The surviving family members, often too weak from their own creeping fevers, were too afraid of the street to carry the weight themselves, would drag their loved ones out onto the stones. The driver, his face wrapped tightly in a vinegar-soaked cloth to ward off the miasma, would silently help lift the body into the back of the wagon. He did not speak words of comfort. There was no time, and it was too dangerous to breathe deeply. He simply stacked the bodies, took the reins, and clicked his tongue to the horse. Scrape, clatter, ring, moving to the next street, the next parish, the next open trench. In this quiet century, you belonged to the passing bell. The cart driver, the hollow-eyed priest, the exhausted bikini, the shunned searcher woman with her white wand, they all belonged to it. They were a shadow society, a dedicated workforce, mobilized by an invisible enemy, performing the necessary, terrible mechanics of an apocalypse while the rest of the world hid behind locked doors. They woke up in the dark. They ate their coarse bread. They gripped the white stick, the iron shovel, the heavy prayer book, the leather reins of the cart. They walked out into the corrupted air day after day, night after night, doing the heavy, heartbreaking things that the rest of the world could not bear to look at. From today's view, they are a fascinating, tragic public health workforce struggling to manage a pathogen they did not understand with the blunt instruments of their time. From their view, they were the damned doing the work of the living, standing waist-deep in the wreckage of the world. And that's what's so chilling.
The dust motes turn slowly in the single pale shaft of morning light. They rise, they fall, they drift without purpose, unbothered by the heavy, suffocating silence of the room. When we read the chronicles of the Great Mortality, we are naturally drawn to the sudden spikes in the narrative. We read about the desperate decrees of kings, the frantic digging of the vast plague pits, the rioting crowds, and the strange, terrifying arrival of the men in the beak masks. We look for the events. We look for the moments of action.
but for the vast majority of ordinary people trapped inside a plague-stricken city, the actual lived experience of the pestilence was not an event. It was a profound, suffocating lack of events. It was a slow, hypnotic waiting. To understand the deepest, most quiet dread of this era, we must deliberately step away from the dramatic moments. We must step away from the overflowing cemeteries and the crowded hospitals. We must simply sit in a shuttered room. We must let the hours stretch out, long, flat, and completely uninterrupted. We must look at the time that left no record. In the medieval and early modern world, time was not measured by the quiet mechanical ticking of a watch on a wrist. Time was a physical sound that rolled across the rooftops and vibrated in the cobblestones. Time was the ringing of the heavy bronze church bells, dividing the day into the strict, ancient rhythm of the canonical hours. Matins in the deep, impenetrable dark, prime at the breaking of the gray dawn, terce in the slow mid-morning, sext at the high, heavy noon, non in the still afternoon, vespers as the sun began to sink, compline at the very edge of the night. These bells were the steady heartbeat of the city. In normal years, they signaled the opening of the market stalls, the breaking of bread, the gathering of the community in the squares, and the beginning of the daily labor. But when the red cross was painted on a door, when the household was legally ordered to seal itself in, the meaning of the bells fundamentally changed. They no longer called the people out into the living world. They simply marked the passage of a day spent entirely within four walls. They became the heavy, acoustic metronome of a locked room. The day begins in the absolute dark with the bell for matins. The sound rings out from the stone tower of the parish church, carrying clearly over the empty streets. The air is cold. Inside the quarantined house, the family lies awake beneath heavy woolen blankets. They listen to the long, fading resonance of the bell, the cold, the quiet, the waiting. They do not speak. They listen to the shifting of the timber beams as the house settles. They listen to the wind rattling the iron latch of the window. And, most of all, they listen to the breathing of the people lying next to them in the dark, waiting to hear the sudden catch in the throat, the shallow rasp, the first sign of the fever taking hold. At the hour of prime, the dawn finally breaks. The light begins to seep under the edges of the heavy wooden shutters, a pale, flat gray that offers no warmth. The air in the room is entirely still. It smells faintly of old wood, unwashed linen, and the sharp, acidic tang of vinegar left in a ceramic bowl on the long wooden table.
Someone rises from the bed. The bare feet step onto the freezing stone of the floor. The physical movements of the morning are slow, deliberate, and terribly heavy. They walk to the stone hearth to stir the gray ashes, trying to coax a small, fragile flame back to life to boil water. Every small ache in the body, every scratch in the throat, every stiffness in the joints is monitored with a quiet, internalized terror. Is it simply the damp, freezing air of the morning, or is it the beginning of the end? The pestilence does not knock. It simply waits in the breath. It waits in the heavy, unmoving air of the shuttered room. By the hour of terce, the mid-morning bell tolls, its low resonance vibrating gently through the floorboards. Outside the locked door, there is the sudden, distinct scrape of heavy leather boots on the stones. It is the municipal watchman. In cities that enforced strict quarantine, a watchman was stationed permanently outside the door to ensure no one left and no one entered. He is the family's only remaining tether to the living world outside. He leans heavily against his wooden halberd. He is the one who walks to the parish well to fetch their water in a wooden bucket.
He is the one who brings the coarse, heavy loaf of dark bread, leaving it on the stone doorstep and stepping safely back. The family stands on the inside of the door. They listen to him breathing on the other side of the heavy oak timber. They listen to the weight of his boots shifting on the cobblestones. They do not open the door to greet him. The bread is retrieved only when he has stepped away. The isolation is complete, perfectly preserved by fear. The long middle of the day is an ocean of empty, unspooling time. At the hour of sext, the sun reaches its highest point in the sky. The heat presses down heavily on the terracotta roof tiles, baking the plaster walls. Inside, the air grows stifling and close. Without the draft of an open window, the smells of the house become dense, layered, and overpowering. They burn dried rosemary and juniper in the hearth to chase away the corrupted air. The heavy scent of camphor and old smoke hangs in the room. The shadows on the floorboards inch across the room, marking the slow, agonizing drag of the sun. An inch an hour. A mother sits on a low wooden stool, blindly mending a piece of torn wool. A father sits on a bench, staring endlessly at the grain of the wooden table. The children, sensing the heavy, unnameable fear in the room, do not run, they do not play. They sit quietly by the hearth, watching the embers pulse and fade. The smoke, the scent, the stillness. There is no plot here. There is no sudden turn of fate, no revelation, no dramatic rescue. There is only the long, flat, unbroken reality of survival. The mind slows down, matching the pace of the creeping shadows.
At the local parish church, a few streets away, the only real movement in the ward is taking place in a small, dim room behind the altar. Here, the daily accounting is performed. The parish clerk sits alone at a wooden desk. A heavy leather-bound ledger is open before him. The paper is thick, made of pressed cotton rags, rough to the touch. The ink in his well is dark, made of iron gall and oak apples. He dips his sharpened quill. He writes a name, he writes an age, he writes the cause of death, plague. He dips the quill again. The scratching of the nib on the rough paper is the only sound in the empty church. He writes another name, plague. He does not write poetry. He does not write lamentations or theological treatises on the wrath of God. He simply builds a column of numbers, a quiet, methodical tally of the vanished. These registers still exist in silent archives today, page after page of neat, careful, repetitive handwriting. They are a quiet monument to a catastrophic sorrow, a record of the hours that simply swallowed people whole. The bell for the hour of none tolls in the mid-afternoon. The heavy brass clapper strikes the rim. The sound rings out, marking the hour whether anyone in the parish lives or dies. The bell does not care. It only measures. In this quiet century, you belong to the passing bell. It measures out your isolation. It measures out your endurance. It rings for the living as heavily as it rings for the dead. The afternoon stretches on. The family listens to the sounds of the street, but the street is entirely empty. Occasionally, the faint rhythmic scrape of the iron-rimmed cartwheel can be heard in the distance, moving slowly through another ward. Scrape, clatter, scrape. The sound metronome of the city, grinding away the hours. The family listens as the sound fades into nothing, leaving the silence even heavier than before. As the light finally begins to fail, the bell for vespers rings. The shadows lengthen, stretching across the floor, blurring the sharp corners of the room into a soft, hazy gray.
The cold begins to creep back through the floorboards, settling into the bones. The family gathers around the table to eat the coarse bread the watchman left hours ago. They chew quietly. They drink the cold water from the wooden bucket. They do not speak of the future. The future is an unimaginable concept, a horizon pulled entirely out of reach by the locked door. There is no next week. There is no next month. There is only the next hour, and the hour after that. And then comes Compline, the final bell, the edge of the night. The dark is the hardest part of the waiting. Tallow candles are expensive, and oil is too scarce to waste on an empty room. The fire is banked low to conserve fuel for the next day. The house sinks back into a deep, impenetrable blackness. The family lies down in their beds once more. They lie on their backs, staring up into the dark, listening to the vast, hollow silence of the city outside their walls. Without the distraction of the pale light, the mind turns entirely inward. Every sound is magnified. The creak of a settling timber sounds like a footstep. The distant, lonely barking of a stray dog sounds like a warning. They lie in the dark, breathing the stale, heavily scented air. They listen to the rise and fall of the chests of their children, of their spouses. They do not know who will be there when the dawn finally breaks. They do not know if the invisible weight is already inside the room, settling onto their skin, entering their blood. They simply close their eyes, surrender to the exhaustion, and wait for the bells of matins to begin the cycle all over again. These are the days that history routinely forgets. The vast, empty, terrifying spaces between the tragedies. The millions of hours spent sitting on wooden chairs, watching the dust motes drift in the pale light, waiting for an ending that might never come. From today's view, these are the hours that left no record, the unmeasured drift of a quarantined life. From their view, they were simply the day, repeated infinitely until it stopped. And that's what's so chilling.
The stone is rough-hewn, heavily weathered by the damp English weather, and covered in centuries of pale green lichen. It sits high on a ridge, overlooking a sweeping, incredibly quiet valley. If you were to walk up to this stone today and brush away the moss, you would see 6 distinct circular holes carved deeply into its flat surface. 300 years after the Genoese galleys drifted into the harbor of Messina, the Great Plague was still making its devastating returns across the continent. To understand the deepest humanity of this dark era, we must make a deliberate widening of the lens. We must step away from the sun-baked cobblestones of the 14th century Mediterranean, jump forward in time to the late summer of 1665, and walk into the damp, rolling green hills of the English Peak District. Here, nestled in a deep limestone valley, sits the small village of Eyam. In the mid-17th century, Eyam was a community of lead miners, weavers, and tenant farmers. They were tough, deeply religious, and closely knit, living their lives to the rhythm of the seasons and the tolling of the parish bell. The newly appointed clergyman for the village was a 28-year-old Anglican named Reverend William Mompesson. He was a young man with a young wife, Catherine, and 2 small children. Mompesson was still an outsider, trying to earn the trust of a divided flock that remained deeply loyal to their former dissenting Puritan minister, Thomas Stanley. The Great Plague was raging 150 miles to the south in London, but in the crisp, clean air of Derbyshire, the apocalypse felt like a distant rumor, until one single parcel arrived on a wooden cart. In September of 1665, the village tailor ordered a box of cloth from the capital to make clothes for the upcoming village festival. When the heavy wooden box arrived, the tailor's assistant, a man named George Vickers, eagerly unpacked the tightly bound bales of fabric. Finding the cloth damp from the long journey, Vickers spread the fabric out in front of the hearth fire to dry. Keep the medical worldview of 1665 intact as you picture this room. The villagers believed the cloth had absorbed the corrupted miasma, the foul, diseased air of London, and that the heat of the fire was releasing this invisible poison into the room. The pestilence does not knock, it simply waits in the breath. We know today, with the quiet certainty of modern science, that the damp cloth was carrying rat fleas infected with the plague, seeking warmth and a new host. Within days of opening the box, George Vickers developed a raging fever. The agonizing dark swellings appeared on his neck. He died in agony, and the passing bell of St. Lawrence's church tolled for the first time in a rhythm that would soon break the village. Through the long, dark winter, the sickness burned slowly, taking a life here and a life there. But as the frost thawed and the spring of 1666 warmed the valley, the plague exploded. The death toll climbed. The terrifying, inevitable reality settled over the limestone cottages. The sickness had taken root in their home. The natural, deeply human instinct was to flee. The surviving families began to pack their wooden carts. They looked toward the roads leading out of the valley, toward the safety of the neighboring market towns, to Sheffield, to Bakewell, to the bustling, uninfected centers of the north.
It was at this exact moment of supreme panic that Reverend William Mompesson and the dissenting minister Thomas Stanley set aside their theological differences. They called the surviving villagers to a meeting in the open air of the churchyard. They had a choice that no one would have blamed them for refusing. They chose the other way, and it cost almost everything. Standing before their terrified neighbors, Mompesson and Stanley proposed the unthinkable. The two ministers laid out the unbearable math of the contagion. If the villagers of Eyam fled the valley, they would carry the invisible death with them. They would spread the corrupted air to the surrounding towns, infecting thousands of innocent people who had no warning. The only way to stop the plague, Mompesson argued, was to draw a circle around the village and refuse to cross it. They proposed a voluntary cordon sanitaire, a total self-imposed quarantine. No one would leave Eyam and no one would enter until the plague had entirely burned itself out. Imagine the sheer, terrifying weight of that proposition. These were practical people. They knew exactly what this meant. By locking themselves in the valley with the sickness, they were mathematically guaranteeing that more of their own families would die. They were willingly trapping themselves inside a burning building to keep the fire from spreading to the next street. Incredibly, standing in the damp grass of the churchyard, listening to the wind in the yew trees, the villagers agreed. They made a solemn, binding oath to God and to each other. They drew a ring of boundary stones around the perimeter of the parish, an invisible wall of pure discipline. At the southern edge of the village, on the high ridge, they placed the main boundary stone. Into the top of this rock, they drilled the 6 holes. They filled these holes with sharp, acidic vinegar, believing the harsh liquid would purify anything it touched. When the trapped villagers desperately needed food or grain from the outside world, they would walk up the hill and leave coins submerged in the vinegar. Outsiders from the neighboring towns would bring supplies, leave the sacks of grain at the stone, and take the purified coins. The two groups never saw each other. They never spoke. The isolation was absolute,
maintained for 14 unbroken months. Inside the boundary, the reality of the sacrifice began to exact its terrible, heartbreaking toll. The sound metronome of the cartwheel ceased entirely, for there were not enough healthy men left to pull the carts or dig the graves. Families were forced to bury their own dead in the fields and gardens behind their stone cottages. The cold, the quiet, the waiting. There is no story from Eyam more devastating than that of a woman named Elizabeth Hancock. The Hancock family lived on a farm slightly removed from the main cluster of cottages. Over the course of just 8 days in August of 1666, the plague entered her home. Elizabeth, entirely healthy, watched her husband and all 6 of her children succumb to the fever. Because the village was strictly adhering to the quarantine protocols of isolation, no one could come to her farmhouse to help her.
Elizabeth was forced to dig the graves herself in a field near her home, a site known today as the Riley Graves. The physical and emotional reality of her labor is almost impossible to process. She was terrified of touching the infected skin of her children, so she tied a heavy rope around the ankles of her dead husband, and then, one by one, her sons and daughters. She dragged them across the floorboards, out the door, and through the wet grass to the open earth. She stood entirely alone in the valley, pulling the weight of her entire world through the dirt, digging through the heavy clay, covering them over, 7 times in 8 days. Down in the village, Reverend Mompesson and his wife Catherine worked tirelessly. Mompesson had sent his 2 small children away to Yorkshire before the cordon was drawn, weeping as he said goodbye, but Catherine had adamantly refused to leave his side. She stayed to nurse the sick, to comfort the dying, and to help her husband manage the food drops at the boundary stone. In August of 1666, during the hottest, most lethal part of the summer, Catherine and William took a short walk in the hills behind a rectory. Catherine turned to her husband and mentioned how remarkably sweet the air smelled that morning. Mompesson's heart stopped. He knew from his time sitting by the deathbeds of his parishioners that the sweet, cloying smell of the air was one of the first sensory hallucinations of the infected. Catherine died a few days later, aged just 29. She is buried in the churchyard, her tombstone a permanent, heavy anchor to the true cost of their decision. Mompesson's letters from this period miraculously survive, written to his children and his patrons. They are filled with a crushing, beautifully articulated grief. He fully expected to die himself, signing his letters as a man already standing in the grave. He wrote, "My drooping and broken heart. I am a dying man, and to all appearances, the grave is ready for me."
But Mompesson did not die. He survived the 14 months of the quarantine, walking among the empty houses, reading the prayers for the dead until his voice gave out. By November of 1666, the biting frost returned to the Peak District. The plague finally ran out of human hosts in the village of Eyam. The sickness stopped. The cordon was lifted. When the gates of the valley were metaphorically opened and the outsiders finally walked down into the village, they found a ghost town. Out of a population of roughly 350 people, at least 260 had died. Entire families had been completely erased from the earth. The stone cottages stood empty, the hearths cold, the looms silent. But the incredible, stunning truth of their sacrifice was this: the plague had not spread beyond the boundary stones.
The bustling market towns of Sheffield and Bakewell were completely untouched. The cordon had held. The fire had burned itself out in the valley, exactly as Mompesson and Stanley had hoped. The villagers of Eyam had absorbed the full, devastating blow of the epidemic to protect people they did not even know. In this quiet century, the village of Eyam chose to belong to the passing bell. They chose to step into the shadow so that others could stand safely in the light. From today's view, it is the most famous, meticulously documented example of voluntary quarantine in human history, a triumph of epidemiological discipline and community courage. From their view, it was 260 neighbors choosing to die for strangers, digging graves for their own children in the wet grass. And that's what's so chilling.
The morning mist in the Derbyshire valleys is thick, cold, and entirely silent. It clings to the damp grass, turning the rough wool of a traveler's cloak heavy with dew. For the last several hours, we have walked through the darkest corridors of the human past. We have looked at the terrified men in the leather masks, the desperate physicians, the overflowing trenches, and the staggering, unimaginable mathematics of the Great Mortality. But history is never a monolith of pure despair. Even inside the worst catastrophe the world has ever recorded, the human heart did not entirely stop. As the dread recedes, as the heavy, corrupted air begins to clear, we are going to look closely at 3 quiet acts of grace, 3 small, documented moments where the machinery of fear simply failed to overcome the instinct for compassion. They are not stories of grand, cinematic heroism. They are small, quiet mercies enacted by ordinary people who decided that even if the world was ending, they would still be kind. This is the first mercy, the mercy of the stranger. Let us return to the high limestone ridge above the village of Eyam in the late summer of 1665. We know the terrible math of their decision. We know that the villagers drew a circle around their homes and refused to cross it, sealing themselves in to protect the surrounding towns. But there is a second half to that story, a quiet truth that exists just on the other side of the boundary stones. If a village seals itself off from the world, it cannot harvest enough food, it cannot grind its grain, it cannot survive the winter. The villagers of Eyam would have starved to death long before the plague finished its work, if not for the people on the outside. Just a few miles from Eyam stood the magnificent, sprawling estate of Chatsworth House, the home of William Cavendish, the 3rd Earl of Devonshire. He was a man of immense wealth and political power. When the plague broke out in the valley, the Earl could easily have ordered his private guards to barricade his estate. He could have turned a blind eye to the dying village. He could have let them starve, reasoning that it was safer to let the fire burn out on its own. Instead, the Earl made a quiet, steadfast commitment. He declared that he would personally ensure the village of Eyam was fed. He organized a continuous supply line of provisions, grain, oats, salted meat, and heavy wheels of cheese. And it was not just the Earl. The ordinary people of the surrounding uninfected villages, the farmers of Stony Middleton and the weavers of Bakewell, stepped forward to help. Every single day, for 14 unbroken months, strangers would load their wooden carts or strap heavy canvas sacks to their backs. They would walk up the long, steep, winding paths into the hills.
Imagine the sensory reality of that morning walk.
The air is cool and smells of rain and wet earth. The stranger carries the heavy sack of flour on his shoulder. He reaches the boundary stone on the ridge. He does not shout down into the valley. He simply lowers the heavy sack onto the damp grass. He looks at the 6 holes carved into the rock, smelling the sharp, acidic tang of the vinegar. He reaches into the liquid, retrieves the few silver coins the villagers have left there, and then he turns around and walks back down the hill. He was feeding ghosts. He was bringing bread to people he knew were already dying, people he would never be allowed to meet, people who could offer him nothing in return but infected coins. The pestilence does not knock, it simply waits in the breath. But on that high ridge, wrapped in the morning fog, the villagers of Eyam learned that even those who belonged to the passing bell were not, in the end, alone. The stranger came every morning. The grain, the meat, the quiet promise, the food was always there. This is the second mercy, the mercy of the rule that bent. Let us step back 300 years to the terrifying winter of 1349. We are in the county of Somerset in the southwest of England. The bishop of this vast diocese is a man named Ralph of Shrewsbury. To understand the mercy of Bishop Ralph, we must remember the profound, crushing spiritual terror of the medieval worldview. The church was not merely a place of comfort, it was the absolute, singular gatekeeper to eternity. The theology of the era dictated that if a person died with unconfessed sins staining their soul, they would be subjected to the agonizing, burning fires of purgatory, or perhaps cast into the eternal dark of damnation. The only way to clear this ledger, the only way to ensure a safe passage into the light, was to have a formally ordained priest stand by the bedside, hear the whispered confession, and administer the last rites. The priest was the key to the lock. But in January of 1349, Bishop Ralph looked out over his diocese and realized the keys were gone. His priests were dead. The rectories were empty. The parishes were falling entirely silent. And in the locked, shuttered houses across Somerset, thousands of people were dying in an absolute, inconsolable panic, terrified not just of the fever, but of the eternal fire that they believed was waiting for them. The church was an ancient, rigid institution built on centuries of unbroken law and absolute authority. It did not bend. It did not share its power. But Bishop Ralph looked at the suffering of his flock, and his heart broke. He sat down at his wooden desk, dipped his quill into the dark ink, and drafted a pastoral letter that essentially surrendered the church's greatest monopoly out of sheer, overwhelming compassion.
The contagious pestilence of the present day, the bishop wrote, has left many parish churches and other cures in our diocese without a priest. Therefore, to save the souls of our flock, we command you to announce that if they are on the point of death and cannot secure the services of a priest, then they should make confession of their sins to any lay person, even to a woman if a man is not available. Imagine the profound, gentle relief of this concession inside a plague-stricken room. The room is heavily shadowed. The air is warm and smells faintly of crushed rosemary. A woman lies in the bed, the heavy fever of the buboes taking her breath. The sound metronome of the passing bell tolls softly in the distance, but it is no longer a sound of pure terror. It is simply a quiet marking of time. She is dying, and there is no priest, but because of the bishop's letter, her neighbor, perhaps an ordinary baker or a weaver or a searcher woman holding her white wooden wand, leans in close. The dying woman whispers her final secret fears.
The neighbor listens. The neighbor holds her hot, trembling hand. And then the neighbor speaks the words of forgiveness. The heavy, crushing spiritual terror lifts. The theology, the fear, the release. The church bent its oldest, most sacred rule simply so a dying parishioner could close her eyes in peace. This is the third mercy, the mercy of the one who did not run. Let us cross the sea to the south of France, to the magnificent sun-baked papal city of Avignon in the sweltering summer of 1448. The heat in the city is oppressive. The Rhone River moves sluggishly past the ancient stone walls. Inside the Palais des Papes, Pope Clement VI sits perfectly still between his two roaring fires, surviving the corrupted air. But outside the walls of the palace, the narrow streets of Avignon have collapsed into a nightmare of suffering. The wealthy physicians of the city, the men with the Latin degrees, the fine velvet coats, and the fast horses, had long since fled. They had looked at the rising death toll, packed their medical texts, and ridden out to their country estates, leaving the poor to die in the gutters. But the Pope's personal physician, Guy de Chauliac, did not saddle his horse.
Chauliac was one of the most brilliant, educated medical minds of the 14th century. He understood exactly how deadly the miasma was believed to be. He had the money to leave. He had the Pope's blessing to retreat to safety. But Chauliac was a physician, and he believed that his duty to the human body superseded his own right to survive. For me, Chauliac later wrote in his quiet, understated medical treatise, to avoid infamy, I did not dare absent myself. He walked out of the massive stone gates of the papal palace and descended into the ruined city. He walked through the sweltering, terrible heat. He entered the cramped, suffocating houses of the poor. He did not wear the heavy, waxed leather armor of the beak mask, for Charles Delorme had not yet invented it. Chauliac simply covered his mouth with a cloth, sat on the edge of the wooden beds, and placed his bare hands on the hot, agonizing swellings of the dying. He offered what little medicine he had. He lanced the buboes to relieve the pressure. He offered cool water. He offered the simple, profound dignity of a witness. He proved to the dying that they were not too loathsome to be touched. And inevitably, the sickness found him. The invisible weight settled into his own lungs. Chauliac contracted the plague. The dark, burning swellings appeared in his groin. The fever spiked, pinning him to his own bed. For 6 agonizing weeks, he lay in the heavy heat of Avignon, fully expecting to die. But even in his delirium, even as the fever boiled his blood, Chauliac did not despair. He called for his parchment and his ink. He carefully, meticulously recorded the progression of his own symptoms. He documented the pain, the heat, the shifting of the humors, using his own dying body as a textbook so that future generations of doctors might learn how to fight the dark. Miraculously, after 6 weeks on the absolute edge of the abyss, Guy de Chauliac's fever broke. The swelling subsided. He survived. He rose from his bed, compiled his notes into the Chirurgia Magna, a text that would guide European surgeons for the next 300 years, and went right back to treating the poor. These are the mercies that survive the dark. The stranger walking up a foggy hill with a sack of flour, a bishop breaking the laws of heaven to offer a dying woman peace, a brilliant doctor sitting on the edge of a ruined bed, refusing to look away. From today's view, these are small footnotes in a catastrophe, tiny data points in a continent of loss. From their view, a loaf of bread left on a stone was the whole of human kindness surviving the end of the world. And that's what's so quietly beautiful. The parchment is stiff with age.
the Latin text written in a tight, meticulous administrative hand, and at the bottom it carries the heavy, dark wax seal of the English crown. In the year 1351, as the unimaginable devastation of the Great Mortality began to slowly recede across the British Isles, King Edward III sat in the cold, drafty stone halls of Westminster and signed a piece of legislation known as the Statute of Labourers. The lords, the barons, and the wealthy landowners of England had come to the king in a state of absolute, unprecedented panic. But they were no longer afraid of the buboes. They were no longer afraid of the miasma. They were terrified of the people who had survived it. When we read the text of the king's statute today, we see an entire social order trying desperately to hold itself together. The king commanded that every man and woman of our realm of England shall be bound to serve him who requires him, and take only the wages, livery, meed, or salary which were accustomed to be given in the places where he oweth to serve. He ordered that wages be frozen. He ordered that no peasant could leave their lord's land to seek better pay elsewhere. He was trying to legislate the world back into the shape it had held before the sickness. But the curiosity of this document, the deep, hidden truth written between its angry lines, is that it did not work. The king wasn't legislating against the plague. He was trying and failing to outlaw the cure to the medieval world's oldest injustice. The Black Death is not a story that ended in 1349. It is the reason a laborer can quit a job, the reason a ship is held in port, the reason a word like quarantine exists at all. It did not pass. It became us. To understand how the plague remade the world, you have to look at the empty fields. Before 1348, the feudal system was an iron cage. A serf was permanently tied to the land, bound to plow the fields and shear the sheep of the local lord. Labor was incredibly cheap because there was a massive surplus of people. The peasant had absolutely no leverage, no voice, and no ability to walk away. But when the plague emptied half the chairs at the tables of Europe, the mathematics of human value fundamentally changed overnight. Imagine a vast rolling estate in the English countryside in the autumn of 1350. The wheat is heavy and golden, ready to be harvested. If it is not cut, it will rot in the autumn rains, and the lord's wealth will vanish. But the village that usually provided 50 men to swing the scythes now only has 15 surviving men. Suddenly, for the first time in the history of the medieval world, the man holding the scythe realizes he has power.
The lords were desperate. They needed blacksmiths. They needed plowmen. They needed shepherds. And so, despite the king's angry statute, the lords began to secretly offer higher wages to attract workers from other estates. They offered better food, lighter taxes, and silver coins. The surviving peasants realized they could simply walk away from their ancestral bondage, travel down the road to the next village, and demand a living wage. The Black Death broke the chains of serfdom. It forced a massive redistribution of wealth. The survivors inherited the lands, the clothes, and the coins of their fallen neighbors. The terrible, crushing silence of the plague pits eventually gave way to the sound of common people realizing their own worth. The feudal order cracked, and through those cracks, the modern working world began to slowly, painfully emerge. But the plague did not just change how we work, it changed how we protect ourselves. Let us travel back to the warm, salt-scented air of the Adriatic coast.
pay off the memory of those 12 Genoese galleys that had drifted into Messina decades earlier, carrying the invisible doom. The horror of the arriving sail had permanently scarred the consciousness of the Mediterranean port cities. In the year 1377, the chief council of the walled maritime city of Ragusa, known today as Dubrovnik, gathered in their stone palace. They looked out at the turquoise waters of the Adriatic, watching the merchant ships approaching from the east, and they wrote a piece of legislation that was completely unprecedented in human history. They decreed that any ship arriving from a plague-suspected region could not dock at the city quays. Instead, the ship, its crew, and its cargo had to drop anchor at the nearby isolated island of Murkan. They were legally required to wait there, completely cut off from the mainland, for exactly 30 days. The Italians called this 30-day period a Trentino. The logic was simple, born of desperate observation. The authorities had noticed that if the sickness was hidden in the hull, it would reveal itself within a month. If the sailors were still healthy after 30 days, the air in the ship was deemed pure, and they were allowed to bring their silks and spices into the city. A few decades later, the Great Republic of Venice adopted this exact same strategy, building isolated plague hospitals on the islands in their lagoon, known as lazarettos. But the Venetians, perhaps out of an abundance of caution, or perhaps referencing the biblical 40 days of the flood and of Christ's time in the desert, extended the waiting period from 30 days to 40 days. In the Venetian dialect, 40 days is 40 giorni. When you hear a news report today about a traveler being isolated, or a ship being held in port, or a city locking its doors against a new pathogen, the word we use is a direct echo of those medieval wooden galleys sitting in the saltwater lagoon. Quarantine. It is the plague's great, enduring gift to public health, an invisible shield that has saved millions of lives in the centuries since.
The legacy of the Black Death is built into our laws, our wages, and our vocabulary. But there is a quieter, much chilling truth that we must face as the hours grow late. The bacteria did not go extinct. The Great Terror of the 14th century was caused by a microscopic, rod-shaped bacterium called Yersinia pestis. It still exists. It still lives quietly in the soil. It still cycles through the populations of black rats, marmots, and prairie dogs in the deep rural pockets of the American Southwest, the steppes of Central Asia, and the forests of Madagascar. Every year, without fail, a few thousand human beings contract the bubonic plague. The pestilence does not knock. It simply waits in the breath. It waits in the bite of a flea. It waits in the dust. But here is the final profound reversal of our long journey through the dark. Imagine a person today living in a modern city who begins to feel a sudden, deep fatigue. The fever spikes, the lymph node in their neck or under their arm becomes agonizingly painful, swelling against the skin. The ancient, terrifying mechanism of the gavocciolo begins its work. They go to a brightly lit hospital, a doctor in a clean white coat standing in a room that smells of sterile alcohol rather than burning rosemary, looks at the swelling. Blood is drawn, not to balance the humors, but to run through a centrifuge and place under a microscope. The diagnosis is made: bubonic plague. And then, the modern doctor does not bleed the patient. They do not recommend sitting between two roaring fires. They do not hand them a pomander of myrrh. The doctor simply writes a prescription for a common, inexpensive antibiotic.
streptomycin or gentamicin or doxycycline. The patient takes a small white pill with a glass of cold water. Within 24 hours, the fever breaks, the bacteria are dismantled at the cellular level, the swelling subsides. In a few days, the patient goes back to work. The gap between their doom and our medicine is breathtaking. The exact same pathogen that emptied continents, that caused priests to abandon their altars, that forced a mother in Eyam to drag her children to a grave with a rope, that world-ending monster is to us a highly treatable infection. From their view, the arrival of the swelling was the absolute, inescapable end of everything. From our view, it is a course of pills, and yet it is the exact same enemy.
The Great Mortality has faded into the archives, becoming a dark chapter in a heavy history book. But the echoes of it have never stopped ringing. Which brings us finally to the sound metronome that has paced this entire script, the bell. In the high stone belfries of rural England and in the sun-baked campanellis of Tuscany, there are heavy bronze bells that were cast in the early 1300s. They are massive, heavy instruments of sound, inscribed with Latin prayers, covered with centuries of dust and bird feathers. These are the exact same bells that were rung by the exhausted priests in 1348. These are the bells that marked the canonical hours of the locked rooms. These are the bells that tolled so constantly for the dead that they drove the survivors to the edge of madness. They still hang there, and every Sunday morning, or every time a wedding is celebrated, or every time a local parishioner passes away, a modern person walks into the base of the stone tower. They take hold of the thick, worn hemp rope. They pull with the weight of their body. And the bell swings. The heavy bronze clapper strikes the rim. Dong. The sound rolls out over the exact same valleys, vibrating through the exact same air. The sound you have heard pacing this entire story is not a recreation. It is not a metaphor. It is a physical vibration that is still ringing today. The bell does not know what century it is. It only knows how to measure the time we have. In this quiet century, you belong to the passing bell. The medieval shoemaker in Siena belonged to it. The searcher woman with her white wand belonged to it. The masked doctor belonged to it. And so do we. We are all bound together by the sudden fragility of the body, by the absolute necessity of human kindness, and by the slow, steady marking of the hours. From today's view, the Black Death is a treatable infection, a line in a demographic ledger, a story we can safely fall asleep to in the comfort of a warm bed. From their view, it was the terrifying, inexplicable end of the world. And the chilling truth is that both are entirely right, and the bell still rings for both. The wind moves steadily over the deep, sweeping green hills of the Peak District. It is the year 2026. The sky above the valley is a vast pale gray, heavy with the quiet promise of afternoon rain. If you were to walk up the steep, winding dirt path that leads out of the village of Eyam today, your boots crunching softly on the loose gravel, you would eventually reach a high, exposed ridge. And there, sitting quietly in the tall, damp grass, you would find a piece of limestone. It is rough-hewn, heavily weathered by 3.5 centuries of English rain, and mottled with pale green lichen. From a distance, it does not look like a monument. It does not look like a gravestone or a memorial. It looks simply like a piece of the earth
pulled from the soil and left by the side of the road. But if you walk closer and kneel down in the wet grass, you will see the distinct, undeniable marks of human hands. You will see the 6 circular holes drilled deeply into the flat top of the stone. The edges of these holes have been worn completely smooth by time, by the rushing wind, and by the freezing and thawing of hundreds of long winters. This is the boundary stone, the object that survived. 360 years ago, this piece of limestone was the absolute edge of the known world for the people trapped down in the valley. It was the line they drew in the dirt. It was the wall they built out of pure, terrifying discipline. Imagine the moment those holes were first drilled. Imagine the sharp, metallic clink of the iron chisel against the stone, echoing out over the empty moors. Imagine the desperate, trembling hands pouring the sharp-smelling vinegar into those shallow cups, and imagine the infected silver coins slipped into the acid, paying for the grain that kept the dying alive just a little bit longer. Today, there are no municipal guards stationed here. There is no heavy, cloying scent of burning rosemary or camphor in the air. The valley below is deeply, profoundly peaceful, filled with the quiet rustle of the ash trees and the distant bleating calls of sheep grazing on the hillsides. The terror of the Great Plague has completely drained away into the soil, leaving only the profound, staggering weight of the sacrifice. Sometimes a modern hiker will walk up this path, a person in a brightly colored waterproof jacket carrying a digital map and a thermos of hot tea. They will stop at the ridge, breathing heavily from the climb, and they will look down at the stone. They might reach out and run a bare hand over the cold, wet limestone, feeling the smooth depressions of the 6 holes. They stand in the exact spot where a terrified, grieving villager once stood, listening to the passing bell 3.5 centuries ago.
The modern hiker stands in a world of antibiotics, of rapid medicine, of global communication, completely insulated from the physical terror of the past. They look out over the beautiful, unbroken green of the valley, take a deep breath of the incredibly clean, sweet air, and then they adjust their backpack and continue on their way. The absolute peace of that moment, the simple, beautiful luxury of taking a breath without fear, is the legacy of the people who stayed behind. We began this long journey tonight by looking at another surviving object. Hundreds of miles away from this windswept ridge, in the quiet, dim light of a climate-controlled medical museum in London, a fragile, hand-blown glass vial rests carefully on a bed of archival foam. That vial represents the desperate, frantic attempt of the human mind to build a shield against the invisible. It represents the masked physicians, the crushed herbs, and the panicked intellect of an era trying to reason its way out of the dark. The vial is kept behind thick protective glass, shielded from the fluctuations of the modern world. But the boundary stone is not in a museum. It sits exactly where it was placed in 1666. It is completely exposed to the elements. It takes the rain, the snow, and the beating sun. It is a monument not to the intellect, but to the heart. It is the physical, enduring proof that ordinary people, faced with the absolute collapse of their world, chose to absorb the blow so that strangers could live. We have reached the end of our long vigil. The fires have burned down to white ashes. The streets of Siena, of Florence, and of London, and of Eyam are quiet once again. It is time to let the history book close its heavy leather-bound covers. The numbers, the dates, the ordinances, and the chronicles no longer matter tonight. Wherever you are right now, lying in the dark, listening to the sound of my voice, thank you for taking this slow journey with me.
Thank you for not looking away from the shadows and for finding the quiet humanity waiting inside them. If you are still awake, there is no need to worry. The next chapter of history is waiting for you whenever you need a place to rest. But for now, it is time to let the mind power down. It is time to let the heavy, exhausted centuries finally sleep. Let the room fade. Let the tension in your shoulders melt entirely into the mattress. The sound of the heavy bronze passing bell, which is echoed through this entire story, grows faint. The tolling stretches out, softer and softer, until the space between the notes becomes a deep, endless quiet. The bell fades entirely, replaced only by the steady, unbothered rushing of the wind over the limestone ridge. The wind over the stone. In this quiet century, you belong to the passing bell, but the bell has finally stopped ringing. The air in your room is clear and cool and perfectly safe. The pestilence does not knock, it simply waits in the breath. But tonight, there is nothing waiting in the dark. There is only peace. From today's view, it's a weathered stone on a quiet English hill. From their view, it was the edge of the world they chose not to cross. And that's what's so chilling and so quietly, unbearably human.